Good evening and welcome. It's 7 o'clock. My name is George Galantis and I teach in Biblical and Theological Studies, where I also direct the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. As we start our time together, it is our custom to begin with prayer. In the long tradition of the church, the evening prayer comes from an ancient song, Os Ilaron. Would you pray with me? Especially today, as we pray, we think of our brothers and sisters, people who suffer in the Pacific Rim. And so we pray. O gracious light, pure brightness of the ever-living Father in heaven, O Jesus Christ, holy and blessed, now as we come to the setting of the sun and our eyes behold the vesper light, we sing your praises, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. You're worthy at all times to be praised by happy voices, O Son of God, O Giver of life, and to be glorified through all the worlds. Lord Jesus, stay with us. For evening is at hand and the day is past. Be our companion in the way, kindle our hearts in a waiting hope, that we may know you as you revealed in Scripture in the breaking of bread. Grant this for the sake of your love. Amen. I welcome you to the 2013 Papa Theophanes Lecture on Early Christianity, sponsored by the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies. Founded in 2009 through a generous gift by Drs. Frank and Julie Papa Theophanes, the Wheaton Center for Early Christian Studies supports and advances the purposes of the college, of Wheaton College, through a variety of programs and acts. We have, for the undergraduate programs, not only do we have offerings in early Christianity, but we also have a certificate in early Christian studies, which is indeed unique among evangelical schools in North America. We offer concentrations in early Christianity in both of our MA programs in biblical studies, in historical theology, that comes out of our theology MA, and in the history of Christianity MA. We also have concentration in the PhD program, and we have already graduated two wonderful colleagues. One of whom is here today. The center also produces publications, and we have, and you can find them on the table, one of the very first publications we had on evangelicals in the early church. Another one is coming out this year, sometime in February, from InterVarsity on Christian Political Witness, and co-sponsoring of the annual theology conference with the Department of Biblical and Theological Studies. But most of all, in our program, apart from the books and the certificates and the programs, we have an array of wonderful colleagues. If you don't know it, and I speak especially to our students, if you don't know how many of your staff and faculty throughout the disciplines, from art history all the way to philosophy and history, and of course our own biblical and theological studies, have as our primary interest of research early Christianity, you would be surprised. If you count them, depends on how we count the historians, they're always a funny bunch. We have 7 or 8, indeed one of the biggest programs and concentrations in North America. My job is not to introduce our speaker. My job is to introduce the introducer of our speaker, who happens to be a wonderful colleague and a new colleague. He's our new chair of Biblical and Theological Studies, Dr. Jeffrey Bingham, who came to us from Dallas Theological Seminary. Yes, the one in Texas, where the weather is always much better. Dr. Bingham is not only the chair of Biblical and Theological Studies, but he's also a renowned scholar in patristics. He specializes in the 2nd and 3rd centuries in earliest Christianity, especially in Irenaeus of Lyon. And it is an absolutely great pleasure to have you, Jeff, as our friend, as our colleague, and now, indeed, as our boss. Please welcome Dr. Jeffrey Bingham.
Elizabeth Clark received her BA from Vassar College in 1960 and her MA and PhD from Columbia University in 1962 and 1965. In addition, she received an STD honoris causa from the University of Uppsala in 2001. Professor Clark joined the faculty of the Mary Washington College of the University of Virginia in 1964, founding the Department of Religion and eventually serving as its chairperson. She remained there until 1982, when after spending the spring semester as a visiting professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, she joined the Duke faculty as a professor in the Department of Religion. She is currently the John Carlisle Kilgo Professor Emerita. Her transforming influence is attributed partly to her scholarly evolution, during which her interest in the application of other disciplines, methodologies, to her own field of patristics and early Christian studies led her first to feminist historiography, next to social network theory, then to post-structuralist literary criticism. In her current work on the creation of patristics in 19th century America, she uses models for reception studies to explain the genesis of her field in the modern discipline. But she is also known as a tremendous mentor. Professor Clark's mentoring is legendary. She is renowned throughout the country and abroad as one of the best mentors in her field. Her well-deserved reputation is built on a mentoring model that, while setting the bar high, ensures that the individual is equipped to reach it. I've known many of Dr. Clark's students, and that testimony is absolutely true. Liz, it is a wonderful pleasure and honor to have you with us tonight. The title of her talk is Rome in the 19th Century Protestant Imaginary: American Professors, Ancient Pagans, and Early Christianity. Would you welcome with me Dr. Liz Clark?
Excuse me. Before we get started, sound system in here regularly has some issues. I need to reboot it for the audio system to work, so please bear with me for a minute. Really sorry about this. Okay, back. System is recording. I'll take the opportunity for a commercial break. And invite you, especially those of you who didn't have to travel too many miles to come here, to in the spring semester, to the two events that we're going to have sponsored through the center. If you put on your calendar, January 30th, Dr. Larisha Hawkins is going to give us a lecture up on the 5th floor of the BGC, of the Billy Graham Center, on race, class, and gender, and community formation. Later in B Quad of spring semester, and we will let you know an exact date, we're going to have another one of those gatherings on community formation through the sacraments. In the meantime, on March 20th through the 22nd, we're going to host here as a department and as a center a symposium with 12 nationally and internationally known evangelicals on a review and a reflection back on 30 years of evangelical engagement with the early church. Has anything changed? Has anything been affected? So put those keep those in your mind as you're planning your calendar in this year. Feel free to keep advertising. We're calling a tech support guy. There's some kind of power switch to reboot the system. I don't have access to it, so it'll be a little bit. Is that okay?
Can I start?
Yeah. Why don't we start and see? Yeah.
I know you don't want to sit here a whole lot. Let's see where we go. Maybe in the middle, all of a sudden it will click in and you can hear a little better. First going to give tonight comes out of some work I did that went into a recent book whose main title was Founding the Fathers. And that was supposed to be a little bit provocative in the sense of thinking about America, but also how the church fathers got founded on the American continent. And in that study, I did archival research at 4 of the seminaries that became centers for the study of early Christianity a little later on, once America got a little further along in its educational development. Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Union Seminary in New York. And the paper I think all of you got when you came in with these names of people you undoubtedly never heard of before. But I'll be talking about them tonight, and it seemed like a good way to give you a really quick version of who these people are, where they came from, where they taught, etc. So I'll also be quoting these people very extensively in my paper, and I'm not going to say quote unquote every time I do it, nor am I going to wave my fingers around. I hope you can tell the difference when I'm channeling Philip Schaff or something, and when I'm speaking in my own voice. I hope so. What did ancient Rome signify to 19th century Protestant professors of theology in the United States? Whereas Petrarch had rhetorically asked, what else is all history, if not the praise of Rome? These professors had a different assessment. It was not the glories of ancient Roman law, art, and government that so captured their attention as Roman immorality, manifested in sexual vice and the institution of slavery. Unlike the 18th century American appropriation of the classics, which, as Caroline Whitterer has detailed, aligned the virtues of Rome with those of the new American Republic, and also unlike the late 19th century praise of high-minded classical study as an antidote to the materialism of the Gilded Age, mere getting and spending. These professors preferred the denunciations of ancient immorality found in Latin satire, political invective, and moralizing literature. They borrowed heavily from Sallust's rhetoric of decline and fall, Livy's description of civic deterioration, Tacitus' attack on imperial vice and praise for Germanic virtues, and Juvenal's vituperative satires, among other Latin writings. The moralizing of such Latin sources found a ready home in these professors' teaching and writing. That they engaged in no hermeneutic of suspicion regarding these sources accords well with their larger purpose, namely, to paint the shining virtue of Christianity amid the darkness of pagan depravity. We search here in vain for a Foucauldian appreciation of the late Roman rigorous care of the self. Rather, Christianity shone more brightly only when the defects of Roman ethical life were highlighted. Moreover, these professors cited Rome's alleged immorality to explain, or more accurately, to explain away, features of early Christianity that they, as Protestants, deemed embarrassing. The development of asceticism, for example, could be partially excused as a reaction against pagan vice, while the early church's failure to maintain Jesus' lofty spirit could be ascribed to Christianity's inheritance of bad material from its pagan environment. In addition, Roman immorality provided a reason for her defeat by sexually virtuous and spiritually minded Teutons. Teutons, whom these Anglo-Saxon professors deem their very own ancestors, served as a way station on the road from pagan immorality to a spiritualized and Hegelianized modern Protestantism. Last, the evils of Roman slavery were good to think with, as 19th century Americans struggled over slavery and emancipation. Christianity, the professors postulated, had gradually, very gradually, paved the way towards emancipation, not wildly and fruitlessly challenging Roman mores, any more than they themselves disrupted contemporary notions of decorous social order. In such ways, the professors appealed to the immorality of ancient Rome to construct their picture of a pure early Christianity and their vision of a righteous Protestant America. The professors of church history I shall here cite, the ones on your sheet, Henry Boynton Smith, Roswell D. Hitchcock, and Philip Schaff of Union Theological Seminary, George Park Fisher of Yale, and Samuel Miller of the Theological Seminary at Princeton, were apologists for Christianity, defenders of its truth and benefits. Hence, I shall refer to them collectively as the apologetic professors. If until about 1870, American colleges acted as the scholarly arm of Protestantism, as has been claimed, how much more might we not expect post-collegiate seminary studies to reinforce Protestant values? Yet, all of the professors, except for the earliest, Samuel Miller of Princeton, had received some advanced education in Germany that opened their minds to the notions of historical development and the higher criticism of the Bible. Here, more radical intellectual currents afoot in Germany challenged traditional American Protestant views. These apologetic professors, uneasily straddling the line between older and newer understandings of Christian history, serve to remind us of how relatively late a religious studies approach to the teaching of early Christian history developed in the United States. Only at the turn to the 20th century does the apologetic approach quietly begin to fade. Yet, I would also emphasize, the Protestant seminary was the closest approximation to graduate education, which developed only haltingly later in the century, in mid-19th century America. These seminary professors were all educated in classics. At that time, about half of an American college student's education, it has been estimated, was devoted to classical studies. As Henry Adams put it, the American boy of 1854 stood nearer to the year 1 than to the year 1900. As much as their views may seem quaint or even distasteful to us, they were among the intellectual presences of 19th century America. As for my sources, in addition to the published works of these professors, the class notes they used in their lectures and the notes their students took, along with memoirs, letters, sermons, and diaries, preserved in the archives of their respective institutions, provide the sources for my talk. Professors Smith, Hitchcock, Schaff, Fisher, and Miller all readily acknowledged that the Roman Empire provided some benefits for nascent Christianity, benefits that they believe manifest God's providential plan for history. Although heathenism, as they called it, heathenism, they assert, had reigned in the world from the days of the Tower of Babel, God had used the heathen nations, including Rome, to work out his purposes. Rome had come just in time to fulfill her providential mission in preparing the way for Christianity, and she did not die until she had ceased to be of service to Christ. Unsurprisingly, they variously list Rome's contributions as organization, law and order, a common language, roads, jurisprudence, universal empire, and the magnificent machinery of government such as the world has never seen again. For some, Rome also gave a sense of humans' commonality, an inkling of monotheism, and a yearning to fill the void left by the decay of what they called the old mythological religions. The Roman Empire at the time of Christianity's birth, Philip Schaff conceded, had comprised all the wisdom, literature, art, and political power of the civilized world. But this civilization, only a few centuries later, would lie prostrate in the dust without a hope of resurrection. Having given perfunctory praise to Rome, the apologetic professors begin their attack. The decisive fault of the Romans was their sexual immorality. Unchastity, the unpardonable sin that no nation ever survives, brought on Rome's death, and this in spite of her Christian baptism. The alleged immoral behavior of Roman deities set a pattern for humans. If the gods are vile, so are the men, and their worship offered no restraint for vice. Henry Boynton Smith of Union Seminary declaimed, "The unchaste gods of Greece and Rome made immoral devotees. Woman was everywhere debased. Unnatural lusts prevailed. The Romans had conquered the world, and nothing seemed left but to enjoy the world. They plunged into the fiercest excesses of gluttony and sensuality. The mass of people were in the deepest moral degeneracy." The apologetic professors adopt a rhetoric of decline familiar from Latin authors themselves. As Catherine Edwards, in The Politics of Immorality in Ancient Rome, has expressed it, the high point of Roman moral virtue was always already situated in an idealized past. The professor's narrative, copying that of the Roman moralists, goes as follows, and I here draw largely from Roswell Hitchcock. In early Rome, there had been virtuous family life, paternal authority, obedient children, and morally decent women. If this begins to sound like Lake Woebegone and Garrison Keillor, for those of you old enough to know about that, it does sound rather like it here. But the Oriental conquest broke down Roman virtue. Although the Romans by nature were better morally than the Greeks, the old Romans of the early Republic being supposedly religious, temperate, chaste, frugal, brave, and faithful, after the Second Punic War, morals began to give way rapidly. The introduction of Greek art into Rome is cited as an important factor in the declining morality. Elsewhere, the professors date the decline back to the time of Alexander the Great, a decline that became hopeless when Rome became an empire. George Park Fisher of Yale opts rather for the time of the capture of Corinth in 146 BCE as the moment when Rome lost her virtue. Her slaves, he tells his class, introduced new and strange forms of wickedness. For Fisher, with Rome's conquest of the East, wealth increased and the seeds of demoralization and decay were planted. As is clear, the moment at which Rome began to decline could vary. In any event, the professors claim that by Cicero's era, unchastity was almost absolutely universal. People abandoned themselves to the most debased pleasures. Alluding to Juvenal, Roswell Hitchcock proclaims that the Orontes discharged itself into the Tiber. Every man became a paramour, and nearly every woman a harlot. The professors also cite evidence for Roman depravity in Seneca, Sallust, Ovid, Horace, Suetonius' Lives of the Caesars, and Tacitus, as well as in Paul's letter to the Romans. After all allowances are made, George Fisher concludes, the impression remains that there was utter degradation in the sphere of morals. As is evident, there was some disagreement on the source of this pollution. Had it come from Asia, from Greece, or from both? Yet in this moral rhetoric of decline, such details were not too important. Greece could be aligned with Juvenal's land of the Orontes. Here, the Christian professors copy the Roman moralists, who themselves ascribed the beginnings of decline to various times and events. But the professors' version differs in that decline, begun before the advent of Christianity, had negatively conditioned the world into which the new religion came. This conditioning helped to account for why Christian morality took hold so slowly and often superficially. One manifestation of Roman depravity lay in what the professors delicately call unnatural vice. Here again, they blame Greece, from which they claim the frightful vice, that is, pederasty and sodomy, was brought to Rome. This unnatural vice disinclined men to marry, hence the Augustan pro-marriage legislation. Even if the rumors about Julius Caesar's same-sex interests were false, George Fisher writes, the mere report of such deeds reveals a measure of toleration which in modern times would render the perpetrator of them an outcast and an object of loathing. Philip Schaff, for his part, finds Greek and Roman sexual practice so disgusting that he retreats to silence. These vices of natural and unnatural sensuality, decency forbids to name. A second aspect of Rome's sexual depravity, whether seen as cause or as effect, is, the apologetic professors allege, the degraded condition of women. The darkest aspect of the environment into which Christianity came, and the great scandal of the time, they say, was the relation between the sexes. Unchastity, the unpardonable sin of history, follows logically from pagans' devaluation of women that assigned them to a lower order. Granted, the professors believe that Rome did better in this regard than had Greece, where courtesans were, so the professors allege, the only cultivated women. Philip Schaff describes the Greek hetairai as desolate characters who enjoyed the sanction of religion for the practice of vice. He indignantly protests that they were esteemed above housewives and were imagined to represent the height of female culture and social elegance. Yet in Rome as well, George Fisher adds, the domestic virtues were broken down. A general aversion to marriage had set in, necessitating the Emperor Augustus's pro-marriage legislation. Fisher repeats the claim that there had been no divorce during the first 500 years of Rome, but the practice later became rampant. The exposure of infants furnished yet another sign that Roman family life was askew. Rome, Roswell Hitchcock concludes, knew nothing of the true domestic condition, of proper family life. Allegiance to and identification with the state swallowed up or even destroyed the family. Against this degradation, the apologetic professors pit Christian teaching on women and the family, two topics that they revealingly align. Unlike the ancient Roman moralists, whom Catherine Edwards describes, who positioned their discussions of social immorality and morality within the realm of politics, the Christian professors treat morality entirely within the framework of religion. Personal virtue and vice concern one's inward spiritual condition, not one's fitness for office or ability to govern. Thus, the professors proclaim, while heathendom held woman in slavery, Christianity raised her. Even in the midst of the church's growing worldliness in the first few centuries, it nonetheless elevated marriage and ennobled woman far above the pagan standard. Philip Schaff exuberantly proclaims, "Woman he writes it all in capital letters, W-O-M-A, woman, was emancipated in the best sense of the word from the bondage of social oppression and made the life and light of a Christian home. What Schaff means by the best sense of the word relates to his denunciation of 19th century feminism. Elsewhere, he writes, Christianity unshackles woman without thrusting her, after the manner of modern pseudo-philanthropic schemes of emancipation, out of her appropriate sphere of private domestic life, and thus stripping her of her fairest ornament and peculiar charm. That way of talking was quite familiar in this period of the 19th century. Schaff argues that freeing woman from slavery to man's lower passions, Christianity accorded her moral dignity and equality with man, and thus began the transformation to a well-ordered family life. But the degradation of the female sex and the want of chastity in antiquity were so great, Schaff concedes, that this ennobling of the family, like the abolition of slavery, was necessarily a very slow process. Morality is here viewed as personal and familial, not political or societal in a larger sense. And the wicked conditioning provided by Roman mores stands as a partial excuse for Christianity's limited success in improving the condition of women and the family. Despite their praise for Christianity's higher morality, the apologetic professors concede that Christianity was not able to transcend some evils of ancient Rome. Rome, in fact, could be blamed for what was less than desirable in the first Christian centuries. According to Roswell Hitchcock, the religious life of the period was conditioned by the rapid decay of the Greco-Roman civilization. It degraded the whole tone of society. The church, by necessity, had to work on the material furnished by the Roman Empire, and this lowered its ethical tone. Even the Holy Spirit, Hitchcock claims, is conditioned by the material on which he works. It was hard, Hitchcock acknowledges, to develop a pure Christendom out of such a rotten heathendom. Although the dreadful moral state of the empire provided a capital background for Christian virtues, it was easy to make men better than the heathen. It was almost impossible to bring people up to the proper average Christian ideal. Hitchcock, in fact, cautions his students not to overrate the ethical standards of the early church. The 3 centuries since the advent of Protestantism, he claims, are infinitely higher ethically than the first 3 Christian centuries. Here, 19th century Protestant morality trumps that of the alleged glory days of the primitive church. George Fisher of Yale similarly acknowledges that since heathenism was entwined with every institution of society, it infused something of its spirit, its belief, and its customs into the Christian community. Wishing to swell the ranks of the baptized, church leaders infected Christianity with concessions to heathen tastes and preferences, namely for authoritarianism, imperialism, legalism, and polytheism in the form of the cult of angels, saints, and martyrs, whom some of you have been studying, I gather. Amidst the localizing of Christian worship, pagan temples were turned into Christian churches, and new splendid edifices were built. Christians forgot that the real temple of God is not a building, but the human soul. Detritus from traditional Roman religion and morality thus offered a partial excuse for the less than spiritual conditions that infected the early church. They really like this language of infection and pollution a lot. In the alleged moral degradation of ancient Rome, the apologetic professors found an explanation for early Christian asceticism. namely as a reaction against the extreme worldliness and heathen sensuality of the Greco-Roman world. Since they believed that ascetic renunciation was foreign to the gospel message and had introduced an unfortunate caste system into Christianity, they searched for ways to explain why it had so arisen. Romans' decadence provided a ready answer. If, Roswell Hitchcock advised, present-day Christians remember that the age into which Christianity came was most debauched and slimy, reeking with pollution, they will cease to wonder at the extravagant morality of Christian renunciants of the first centuries. The Christian today, Hitchcock advises, may lament ascetics' pusillanimous despair and their desertion of a world which they ought rather to have stayed and mended. But he will learn to moderate his indignation and temper his reproofs with charity. Philip Schaff seconds Hitchcock's explanation. We cannot wonder, he writes, at the high estimate of celibacy, which in the eyes of many seemed to be the only radical escape from the impurity and misery of married life as it generally stood among the heathen. Christians were enthusiastic for angelic purity in opposition to the horrible licentiousness of the Greco-Roman world. Paul's promotion of celibacy in 1 Corinthians 7, a chapter that might make Protestants uncomfortable, is understandable as a radical cure by absolute abstinence under the peculiar circumstances of the time. Asceticism, then, could be partially blamed on the evils of Roman society, against which Christians rebelled with an excess of enthusiasm. Over against degenerate Romans, the apologetic professors pitted Teutons, the Germanic tribes that overran the Roman Empire and eventually succeeded it. The Germans are here credited with taking Roman government, literacy, agriculture, urban life, and, most important, Christianity, and from them forging a new civilization. For Roswell Hitchcock, Providence, that is God, brought in the Teuton blood to reinvigorate a decaying Christendom and transmit to modern times the intellectual and aesthetic treasures of Greece and Rome. Christianity's failed attempt to arrest Roman decay prompted God to provide this new blood. Teutonic civilization, in Hitchcock's eyes, was a great gain over the Greco-Roman. Not only were the Teutons superior morally, they were superior physically to the Romans, who had been, supposedly, dwarfed and enfeebled by their dissolute civilization. The Teutons were also better psychologically than the unmanly Greco-Roman civilization, which, given to pedantic fineness, overvalued form and undervalued spirit. Religiously superior as well, the Teutons, supposedly, had a deep sense of the infinite and a future life. In fact, Hitchcock proclaims, Luther and Hegel were already in embryo in the race. I like that. Yeah. Politically, the Teutons, unlike the elitist Romans, had an intense passion for individual freedom, a proper regard for what is human. In the West, Hitchcock concludes, the Teutonic triumph contributed to human progress. The apologetic professors are, on this topic, highly indebted to Tacitus' account of Teutonic virtues in the Germania. They read their Roman sources devoid of any hermeneutic of suspicion. According to Roswell Hitchcock, although the Teutonic barbarians were rough and rude, given to gluttony and hard drink, they were less given to some forms of sensuality than the Greeks and Romans. Tacitus, in Hitchcock's view, does not overpraise their sexual purity. George Fisher also privileges Tacitus' description of the Teutons' outstanding domestic virtues and chastity, although conceding that their nobles were allowed to practice polygamy. For Philip Schaff, the qualities Tacitus praised in the German women are now to be seen most fully developed in the Anglo-Saxon race. Indeed, the professors see themselves as the descendants of the virtuous Teutons, whom they construe as forerunners of Protestant morality and religion. Roman vice, then, provided a reason for the empire's well-justified fall to spiritual proto-Protestant Teutons. If sexual immorality was one favored trope for thinking about Rome, slavery provided another and more difficult topic. More difficult in that early Christian texts gave less occasion for Christian pride and opened, in the professor's views, an opportunity for misuse of the Bible. Pro-slavery Americans could appeal to Christianity's tolerance of slavery in the Roman Empire to justify their own practice. The apologetic professors engaged in somewhat contradictory rhetoric on this topic. They decried Roman slavery, yet struggled to rationalize, indeed to explain away, why early Christianity did nothing to abolish the institution. While claiming that all humans were equal in God's eyes, they denounced abolitionists of their own era as extreme. Here, the general social conservatism of the apologetic professors comes to the fore. In theory, all the apologetic professors oppose slavery, ancient and modern. Even Samuel Miller of Princeton, the only professor here discussed who himself had owned slaves, nonetheless saw slavery as holding men in illegal and forcible subjection. Hitchcock calls slavery a violation of human rights that denies the unity and equality of the human race. Philip Schaff, for him, slavery entails the robbing of immortal man, created in the image of God, of his free personality, degrading him to an article of merchandise, a mere machine of his owner, and thereby hindering the development of his intellectual and moral powers and the attainment of the higher end of his existence. Although ancient philosophers vindicated slavery as natural and necessary, Schaff argues, Christianity, in principle, teaches that in Christ there is neither bond nor free, Galatians 3:28. Despite these beliefs, the professors were forced to concede that Jesus and the apostles did not forbid slavery. Why not? Their answers run along similar, largely pragmatic lines, such as, Jesus did not think it proper to interfere with political arrangements and the civil laws of the Roman government. Jesus anticipated no civil revolution to set up a new state. Since Christians were not citizens, but rather subjects, they had no responsibility for the government of the empire. If the church had advocated the abolition of slavery, it would have been crushed by Rome. Christianity as a persecuted sect had no influence on the state. The apostles wisely knew that a sudden political and social abolition would have resulted in revolution, throwing everything into confusion. Outward violence and revolutionary measures in those times would have been worse than useless, Schaff concludes. In such ways did the apologetic professors rationalize early Christianity's failure to attack the institution of slavery. Nevertheless, the apologetic professors adamantly argue that Jesus and the apostles really did oppose slavery. The very principles of the Christian religion tended towards its destruction. Although Paul's letter to Philemon, his first letter to the Corinthians, and the domestic arrangements presupposed in the pastoral epistles and the household codes found in various New Testament books, all these show that the early Christians accepted the institution of slavery. The apologetic professors press these texts to argue that Christianity at least mitigated its evils. Philip Schaff's explanation for early Christianity's quietism on the issue of slavery centers on the new religion's abhorrence of violence. Christianity seeks, like a leaven, to transform from within. Both apostles and church fathers acquiesced in slavery, knowing that a gradual, silent cure is always the most safe and radical in the end, Schaff writes. A cure which first mitigates the evil, takes away its sting, and effects at last its entire abolition. Christianity tempers the malignant force of slavery through the spiritual bond of master and slave in Christ. Schaff, who assigns the origin of slavery to the fall in the Garden of Eden, claims that the New Testament, written for all ages and all conditions of men, knows no Mason and Dixon's line. Astoundingly, he even labels Paul the greatest benefactor of the slave. Excuse me. Thus, the professors argue that Christianity, despite its quietism, contributed to the gradual elimination of ancient slavery. Philip Schaff, for his part, argues that Christianity gave slaves a much-needed moral training that would later enable them to benefit from freedom. Sudden external emancipation would not have been a boon for either master or slave, he posits, since the world was not yet ready for general emancipation. Nevertheless, Schaff concludes, we know that Christianity spread among the slave population and that Christian slave owners recognize manumission of slaves as a pious act. The apologetic professors unanimously condemn slavery as an institution in America. Their comments chronologically span the Great Divide of the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863. Writing at the turn to the 19th century, Samuel Miller, who was by far the earliest of these professors, rhetorically asked, was it not enough that God had consigned Africans to arid plains, to noxious vapors, to devouring beasts of prey, and to all the scorching influences of the torrid zones? Must violence, captivity, and slavery be superadded to their torments? Years afterward, Henry Boynton Smith of Union Seminary wrote the resolution on slavery that was adopted by the Presbytery of New York in 1857. Slavery in America, he declared, was a system which is essentially opposed to the rights of man, to the welfare of the Republic, to the clear position of our church, and to the principles of the Christian religion. A decade later, in a report on religion in America for an international meeting of the Evangelical Alliance, Smith claimed that slavery, now abolished in America, had been the one great hindrance to the realization of the essential ideal of the American Republic. Hitchcock, for his part, taught his students that slavery in America had made our country the curse of Africa. And Philip Schaff told audiences in Germany in 1855 that slavery was the Achilles heel of the United States, a relic of barbarism and heathenism. Interestingly, Philip Schaff's son reports the rumor that his father's support for the Union during the Civil War dashed his chance of winning the professorial chair of church history in Berlin. Whether that is true or not would be interesting to find out. In 1861, in the midst of the nation's crisis, George Fisher of Yale publicly pondered the question, what inscrutable decree of providence led slavery to be implanted on this continent? To this question, Philip Schaff ventured some answers. A great partisan of America as the land of freedom, Schaff, at the beginning of the war, was living close to the Gettysburg battlefield, from whence he moved to New York. We can follow Schaff's changing rhetoric on slavery as the country heated up for the Civil War. In 1853, a decade before emancipation, Schaff had proclaimed the writings of abolitionists Theodore Parker and William Lloyd Garrison to be unsound, fanatical, and extremely radical in all political and social questions, and infidel in religion. Some abolitionists, he complains, run into radical excesses, even supporting women's rights, thus doing their cause more harm than good. Writing perhaps 2 months before the firing on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Schaff claimed that the descendant of Ham, that is the slave, was being trained in America for his final deliverance from the ancient curse of bondage by the slow but sure operation of Christianity, both upon him and his master, and for a noble mission to the entire mysterious continent of Africa. He advises Northerners not to agitate or to engage in uncharitable abuse of Southerners, and cautions Southerners, for their part, not to emancipate precipitously, as Negroes are unprepared for independence. Schaff strongly chastises modern abolitionists of the infidel type, who secularize the holy philanthropy of the gospel, subordinate the spiritual relations to the temporal, and magnify the slavery question above every other moral question. In 1865, post-emancipation, to an audience in Germany, Schaff claims the Civil War was a punishment sent by God upon the American people. Schaff still calls slavery in America an interim training school for a dependent race. But in America, God changed their curse into a blessing. And in the early 1880s, Schaff, despite his previous defense of early Christian quietism, credits Christianity with the gradual extinction of slavery. American slavery, he had early written, was not nearly so onerous as slavery in ancient Greece and Rome. Roman slavery extended over the entire empire, and half of its subjects were slaves, while in America, slavery was limited to the South and to 1/8 of our population. Rome legalized and protected the slave trade, while America has now forbidden it. Rome cared nothing for the souls of slaves, while in America, Christianity humanizes the master and gives benefits and privileges to the slave. Schaff was not the only one of the apologetic professors who faulted the abolitionists and credited Christianity instead with the abolition of slavery in America. Yet, post-emancipation, the professors like to credit Christianity with the abolition of slavery, a slavery that never was as bad as Roman slavery, and in any case, prepared the Negro for a higher vocation. In retrospect, it is striking how long it took for assumptions regarding Rome and Christianity, such I have here detailed, to be questioned. New professors, such as Arthur Cushman McGiffert of Union Seminary, came to the fore and were less eager to credit Christianity with everything good and Rome with everything bad. McGiffert, for example, is generally critical of the theory of Roman degradation and Christian enlightenment that dominated his predecessor's rhetoric. He argues rather that the supposed beneficial effects of Christianity upon the Roman world are very difficult to substantiate. In fact, society at large in the 4th and 5th centuries, now in the process of Christianization, he writes, society then seems even more corrupt than in pagan times. As for the common assumption among historians that the social conditions of the empire would have been much worse without Christianity, McGiffert flatly states there is no way either to prove or to disprove this claim. Nor is there evidence that women's position was appreciably higher in the later than in the earlier days of the Roman Empire. Christianity itself downgraded family life, he concedes. Concerning Christianity's effect upon Roman slavery, McGiffert does not credit Christianity with the abolition or even mitigation of ancient slavery. Christians accepted it without question, he wrote, just as they accepted the state, the prevailing differences in social rank, and the common inequalities in economic condition. Nor can Paul be made out as a friend of the slave, since he urged converted slaves to stay in the service of their masters. The decline in the number of slaves in the later empire for McGiffert probably had nothing to do with Christianity. Nor was manumission any commoner among the early Christians than among pagans. The church itself, he notes, after it became a legalized corporation, held large numbers of slaves along with other kinds of property. Rather than crediting Christianity with abolishing ancient slavery, McGiffert seeks different explanations for the decreased number of slaves in the later empire, namely, changed economic conditions in which the commercial and industrial classes gained more power, with a concomitant displacement of the old landed aristocracy. Moreover, as Rome was no longer in a conquest mode, its supply of slaves from victorious battles decreased. And as great estates fell into decay, the ability to keep large numbers of slaves also declined. To attribute to Christianity any controlling influence in this general and inevitable process is altogether to mistake the situation, McGiffert concludes. Speaking in 1923, McGiffert offers a pointed critique of the modern economy in comparison with the ancient Roman slave society. Whereas slavery formerly meant the control of one man by another for the latter's profit, now it commonly takes the form of control by a state or by a class. This, too, McGiffert claims, is slavery. Roman immorality, in effect, had not been overcome by Christianity, but had been resuscitated in modern times in another sphere, that of industrial capitalism. Rome, in other words, need not be in Rome. The teaching of early Christian history has here encountered modernity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As a Greek, I don't know how to respond to the hype.
It's your fault, right?
Our fault. We invented everything and we take the blame for everything.
Yeah.
Let's open the time. Dr. Clark has agreed to take questions, so the floor is open for you. You have to speak into the mic.
You started with how the apologetic professors sort of just adopted wholesale the narrative of Roman decline, and yet by the end we started to hear they were really pretty down on Rome in general. So I just wondered, could you speak a little more to, do they have to canonize the golden age of Rome in order to adopt the narrative of decline? Is it decline from what in their minds?
So, well, yes, I suppose they pick up on these Roman moralists who themselves put different kind of dates as to when things started to go downhill, depending on where they lived. I don't think these professors had any very original ideas about this they were putting forth. They were just quoting what they found in some of the classical sources and using it for, obviously, their own purposes to show that Christianity was a whole lot better than whatever Rome was. They, like some of these Roman moralists, they could point back to the old days of the Republic. Roman moralists always like to point backwards like that, as Catherine Edwards said, the high point's always already somewhere back there, you know. And so they could say, oh yes, in old Republican Rome, women were virtuous and children obeyed and all these things, right? But then at various points, things really started to fall apart. So, now, of course, old Rome was pagan too, so in that sense, it wasn't, you know, any better in some way, but at least they weren't so sexually immoral, supposedly, right? Yeah.
because this was so interesting, I'm wondering if I can ask you to push it a little bit further. We
Yeah.
ended with McGiffert,
Yeah.
who's accused of heresy. Could you
Yes.
perhaps comment upon that? And what, now that of course his modernist perspective is itself under critique, what were some of his limitations, if you could continue?
Thank you. Whereas, McGiffert, this last person, I'll be writing on him rather extensively in this next book I'm doing. He was trained in Germany. He was the one who got a real PhD in Germany with Adolf von Harnack, first in Marburg, and then he went to Berlin. So he learned all kinds of very startling things in Germany that he brought back. I can say about his heresy trial, this is interesting. He was part of the Presbyterian Church, as you gathered from reading this, but he did write a book on early Christianity quite early in his career. And just in a footnote way on into the book, he says, rather without making a big point of it, it's not very clear whether Jesus really intended the Last Supper to be a meal that would be celebrated in a sacramental sense on into the ages. This was the real point that got him. The presbytery, some members, more conservative members of the Presbytery of Pittsburgh and then of New York, jumped on this case and found all kinds of other things in the book that they found quite heretical. I think today most New Testament scholars would think, well, that might be the case. But he, yes, in terms of sort of limitations, he was trained, as I said, by Harnack, and also he was a great devotee of a 19th century German theologian, Albrecht Ritschl. And part of that theme was about how we work together to bring the kingdom of God in. And of course, Harnack had these phrases about the fatherhood of God, the brotherhood of man, and whatever. Well, this all sounded quite nice until New Testament scholars really got on the case of the great prominence of apocalyptic eschatology in the synoptic gospels. And all of a sudden, the kingdom of God could not really be understood as the brotherhood of man and working together to bring in the kingdom. This was going to be a great event in which God was going to break into the world and knock down everything as it was, and then there'd be something else on the other side, maybe, etc. McGiffert, reading through his material and his class notes and all, he knew all this, and he told the students about the eschatological turn, as I've come to call it. But in his own theology, he went right on with Ritschl and bringing the kingdom of God. He really couldn't reconcile these two things together. And who knows, maybe they're not reconcilable in some kind of way. But you could see him kind of straddling the older Ritschlian view about the kingdom and all with newer concerns. So there's one kind of drawback for him. He became, when he was right on the point of getting kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, he became a Congregationalist, which apparently he thought would be a little looser in terms of letting him express his theological ideas as he saw fit. That turned out to be the case, I think. Yeah. This one over here, well.
I was wondering why the premium on sexuality
Yeah.
as the marker of downfall, and not necessarily like political response to outside forces or even like socioeconomic policy. But it seems as though it seems as though they're carrying so much of almost this Victorian idea on purity, that the purity of the individual's sexuality is what makes them either a good or a not good person.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that. And they were all married in these rather conservative kinds of ways and so forth, and they thought this kind of domestic arrangement that they themselves favored in 19th century America was the way God really intended everybody to live, etc. But it is funny. I've sometimes wondered, they're all teaching these boys, 20, 21, 22 years old in seminary, whether they want to stress this theme about sexual purity over and over again, and that particular context, whether that maybe gave an added little charge to what they were talking about here. Because, yes, I quite agree with you. There are all kinds of things you could use from the Roman situation to talk about politics, social issues, etc. And these people were certainly not the most conservative of their day either. They, particularly Roswell Hitchcock in New York, was out there fighting the Tweed Ring and things like this. So they did have other interests too, but they really got off on the sexual part of it. You're quite right.
There were a number of things that I found interesting in your talk. One that I want to ask you to nuance more was your comment on their own focus of the Tacitian Teutonic, almost the noble savage kind of idea. I'm fairly familiar with the Germanian, and where I've seen that before is in work that 19th century English linguists did in the discovery of the roots of English as an Anglo-Saxon and possibly superior language, trying to find identity. That's part of nascent 19th century English nationalism. Yeah. And so I've thought of it mostly from the UK perspective. And can you say more, about that Anglo-Saxon American idea, but also what is it in the final decades of the 19th century that recovers the yay Rome kind of idea, classical resurgence?
Yeah. About the latter, I can only say what I've read in other people's books about this, to talk about the noble virtues of Republican Rome over against this Gilded Age concern with money. I mean, this is the age of the robber barons and all this kind of thing, so they could use it in that kind of sense. All these professors loved Germany. Philipp Schaff was Swiss, but he was educated in Germany in part. They went back to Germany all the time. They read. Germany was the only place that had any real scholarship from their point of view. It's interesting, although they hobnobbed with some of the people from England in, say, the Evangelical Alliance and so on, it wasn't English scholarship, it was German scholarship. That was the high water mark that they all aimed for. And they really wanted to transplant that kind of German scholarship to America. So I think anything that they could, think was so wonderful about Germany here, they could do that. Now, you could say this picture of the Teutons in Tacitus is probably a little silly, right, from scholars' point of view today, but you can see what they wanted to do with it. So.
I was wondering if you could maybe identify or diagnose what you would say was kind of maybe a few of the central problems in the way that the apologetic professors did their historiography that led to such pervasive misinterpretation, and then maybe apply that to our context and say maybe how that is instructive for how we do our historiography of the early church.
Yeah. Now, I can't say they were very original. They read church history textbooks by German professors, so they picked up a lot of this from those textbooks. And they were always mourning that they didn't have any good textbooks in English that they could give their students to read. These were not original, thinkers, I think we can say. And again, they just idolized Germany in some kind of way for this. So, well, I suppose one lesson would be just don't take your church history out of a textbook. You've got to go more to the primary sources. Now, they knew that, but a lot of them wrote these big, sweeping histories of Christianity. Philipp Schaff has 6 volumes, I think, of the history of the church. And, you can't be an expert in all that stuff, so you take it out of other people's books, whatever. So, of course, you're maybe not doing the best kind of interpretation. So in a way, you could say, go to the primary sources. That's one moral you might get out of all this, I think, yeah.
If we can pursue that a little further, you have in your career you have been president of the North American Patristic Society, president of the American Society of Church Historians, of the American Academy of Religion, and on and on and on. In your experience, how have we changed? Have we changed in the last generation or two?
I suppose every little generational bit reads things in terms of the interests of their day. There's no denying that, I think. Yeah, I think our field, if you go early Christianity, or study of early Christianity, our field, it certainly branched out and included many more things. We were talking earlier about Syriac and Coptic and Byzantine studies and all kinds of things. When I was in graduate school, it was pretty much Greek and Latin, you just can't do that anymore. And so that certainly the whole social dimensions of early Christianity have gotten a great deal more attention the past 3 or 4 decades than they ever had before, I think, et cetera. So yeah, I think there's quite a lot of things we've learned from other fields, from anthropology, from literary theory and criticism, and so forth, about how to read texts, maybe, not so gullibly as perhaps these people read their texts.
Thank you so much. So Liz, back to historiography for a minute. If the apologists and McGiffert are reading the Germans, what accounts for McGiffert's historiographical turn? Is it the eschatological turn, or is there something else? Was he reading different Germans? How was he reading them differently?
I think both he and the professor who taught early Christian history at Harvard right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, Ephraim Emerton, they'd studied actual Roman history with professors who were really professors of Roman law and Roman history, et cetera. And probably from them, they got different ideas than they did from just the church historians, not just going with what it says in church history textbooks, but actually beginning to do this. One thing that was interesting to me in my work on the book I mentioned was they all, or at least the later ones, they got thrilled with what they called the seminar method, or the seminary method, as they called it. You just put all these books on the table and people had to read from the sources and make arguments about them and come up with theories. And this was totally exhilarating for people who had just been raised on textbooks. And it's hard to imagine what classrooms must have been like in the early to middle 19th century. The professor just had a textbook and the students learned it, and the professor came in and asked you what was in the textbook and you told him, and that was the class. You didn't really have to know very much to teach this stuff. It was just the textbook. And once they began to have seminars, first of all, you had to have materials to do this, real libraries with primary sources and so forth, and then the students had to be taught how you read primary sources and how you learned to argue from them, and what constitutes a kind of thesis in historical scholarship. All that came in, and they were pretty excited about it, but they did regret America. The conditions in which these people worked were absolutely awful when you read about it. They didn't have books, they didn't have libraries. Very often they didn't have pay, and so it was hard for them to do the things that they kind of dreamed about, that they heard were happening in Germany and so on. So I think some of those things came together. And it seemed to me McGiffert filled Schaff's chair right after Schaff left and then died. McGiffert came in. And it's really like you're reading in a different century already or something. You say, how to account for that? So I think your question's a good one, which are probably many factors there. He probably wasn't so pious in a certain kind of way as Schaff was anyway. So.
We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll...
Was the shift to a more negative view of Rome associated at all with a shift in American political
How would you think about that? I'm not sure. You want to say a little more?
Maybe thinking about American conceptions of themselves as the new Rome, and would that have to go away before they could view Rome as negatively?
Yeah. I think so. When you read about those people in the late 18th century who wanted to claim Rome as, we in America are building the new Rome, and I think art historians and have gone around and done a lot looking at the buildings that constituted that period, et cetera. Yeah, so these professors had a rather different view, right? But it was, to suit their purposes. Certainly people like Philip Schaff were great admirers of America and were very patriotic in all these respects, but they didn't have that kind of idea that everything about Rome was how we should build America by any means. Yeah, it's good.
Just to follow up on that, would you say that these apologists were, because it seems like they were trying to, they just blindly assumed or took on these assumptions, and they weren't really original, because their agenda wasn't exactly defending Christianity, because I would like to suggest that perhaps they were apologists of Americanism, if I could say that, but I would like to know what you think. Were they first trying to defend Christianity, or were they first trying to defend America and the American Republic?
I think they were trying to defend Christianity, but they were, they loved these lines from a poem that Bishop Berkeley wrote about. I can't remember exactly how it goes, but it's all about how the sun goes from east to west, and the last place the sun goes is way in the west. He wrote this one, Berkeley, when he was in California visiting, and I think that's what he meant. Like Philip Schaff loved this poem, was quoting it all the time. So they were kind of exponents of American exceptionalism in some way. America was going to be different from the old ways of doing things, but I think probably it was the Christianity they wanted to promote here.
Thank you. One of the things that we're learning more and more from your work and from the work that we all do together as historians, and including the work we do as a center, is to think rightly, to ask questions rightly. And I'm reminded, as you were speaking, of Wisto Gonzalez's work on, or phrase that he uses, the difference between responsible remembrance, history done well as responsible remembrance, versus selective forgetfulness. And he uses a phrase that says that responsible remembrance demands proper action. And sometimes we're not willing to do that at the end. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.